World History Discussions on the Traditions and Encounters textbook, Chapter 6 on the Early Societies of the Americas and Oceania. The way this textbook is arranged, I told you it's not Eurocentric, but it is Eurasia-centric for the most part. But this textbook tries to include every part of the world, and I would break Chapter 6 into 3 sections. First, the biggest section is on these 3 civilizations in Mesoamerica, modern-day Mexico and Guatemala, basically, with the Olmecs at their peak between 1200 and 100 BCE, and then the Mayans, which start to rise around 200 BCE, but then peak from about 300 to 800 CE and decline by the year 1000, and finally Teotihuacan, which is near modern Mexico City, and it also rises around 200 BCE, much like the Mayans. In fact, it even will eclipse their first capital of Camino-Juyu, and that will happen around the year 300 CE, and Teotihuacan's at its high point from about 400 to 600, while the Mayans, with their new capital at Tikal, are at their height from about 300 to 700, and then just like the Mayans decline after 800, Teotihuacan is pretty much destroyed in 750. But anyway, if you notice anything interesting about the dates in here, it's not all BCE like the first 5 chapters, and it doesn't just end around, this chapter doesn't end around the year 500 BCE like the previous chapters on the River Valley civilizations did. This one goes all the way to the year 1000 CE, or just 1,000 years ago. Why is that? Because we won't revisit this region of the world again until chapter 20 in this textbook. So basically, this textbook, as I described, is divided into 7 major time periods, and this is the last chapter in time period 1, the ancient world, which is roughly 3500 BCE up through 500 BCE. The second section is going to be from 500 BCE up to 500 CE, and that's the classical world. But we get one classical civilization in this very chapter, in chapter 6, and that is classical Maya. They're actually on the timeline a little bit later than the classical civilizations we'll be studying in the next few chapters, because Achaemenid Persia is in the 500s to 300s BCE, and then when we get to like the Greeks, they're at their peak in the 400s BCE, and then the Romans around the year 0, peaking at 117 CE. Han Chinese between about 200 BCE, 206 BCE, and 220 CE. But you get the point. Those classical civilizations peak around the time of Christ, around 2,000 years ago, and most of the years in those chapters are from about 500 BCE to about 500 CE, whereas the Mayans have their peak a little bit later, around 300 to 700 CE, when the classical civilizations in the Eastern Hemisphere are going into decline in the post-classical period, which in this textbook will be chapters 13 to 16, covering the years 500 to 1000. But this chapter covers from beginnings to about the year 1000 in Central America first, then in South America, and then in Australia, New Guinea, Oceania, and the Pacific Islands at the end. So it's a lot of the world and a lot of years of history in this chapter. This is chapter 6, like I say. And then we don't come back to this part of the world until chapter 20. That's when we get into the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas in Peru, and the last 500 years before European conquest and quote discovery of this part of the world. That's chapter 20. So I told you that Traditions and Encounters does a great job on not being a European history book, but really being the history of the entire world. But it is very Eurasian-centered, simply because Europe and the Near East and Asia, where we have the most writing and the most evidence of society and all the trade. We're going to get into all that in the next section on the classical empires. But I warn you, chapters 7 to 17 are all about Europe or Asia. Finally, in chapter 18, we get to sub-Saharan Africa, and we cover it all the way up to 1500 CE. And then in chapter 20, we come back to this part of the world, 1000 to 1500. Here we go. Woohoo!